The strangest people in the universe are never the ones everyone watches. They are the ones nobody remembers seeing at all. Morning arrived over Cartho's central station beneath a ceiling of transparent alloy where freighters drifted silently past distant planets wrapped in pale blue rings. The endless marketplace below had already come alive. Vendors shouted special prices in a dozen languages. Cargo drones floated overhead carrying sealed containers the size of pickup trucks. Steam curled upward from food stalls while holographic advertisements painted moving colors across polished metal walkways. Thousands of travelers crossed the station every hour. Merchants bargained. Children laughed. Security officers monitored the crowds without looking away from their scanners. Life moved quickly enough that almost nobody noticed what remained perfectly still. Ethan Carter stepped off the transit platform carrying a weathered engineering case that looked older than some of the ships docked outside. At 34 years old, the human maintenance engineer had spent most of his career repairing engines that everyone depended on but almost nobody appreciated. His brown work jacket carried faded company patches stitched over older repairs. His heavy boots echoed softly against the station floor as he checked the replacement components listed on his handheld maintenance tablet. His assignment was simple. Buy a quantum regulator. Return to docking ring 8. Finish repairs before sunset. Then leave. Nothing about the morning suggested that his plans were about to disappear forever. The crowd flowed around him like a river around smooth stone. Business travelers hurried toward departure gates. Families searched for restaurants. Street musicians filled the air with unfamiliar melodies played on crystalline instruments. Ethan barely looked up until something unusual slowed his pace. Not a sound. The absence of one. A circular section of the marketplace remained strangely empty despite the crowd surrounding it. People adjusted their paths without realizing it. Some stepped aside at the last second. Others glanced toward the center before immediately looking away as if their attention had been gently redirected. No warning signs marked the area. No security barriers stood nearby. Yet everyone avoided it. Ethan frowned. Engineers noticed patterns because machines always followed them. People usually did too. He followed the invisible circle until he reached its center. Sitting quietly beside a steel support column was a young alien woman wearing a simple gray travel cloak faded by time and dust. Her blue skin carried a faint luminous glow beneath the station lights. Long silver hair rested across one shoulder, partially hiding delicate markings that shimmered softly along her cheekbones. Her golden eyes remained lowered toward the floor, while both hands rested peacefully in her lap. She did not beg. She did not call for help. She simply existed. Around her, travelers continued walking as though she had become part of the architecture years ago. Ethan stopped completely. An elderly merchant brushed past his shoulder without slowing. Two station workers rolled equipment carts between them without acknowledging the woman sitting only a few feet away. Even a cleaning drone carefully circled around her before continuing its programmed route. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody seemed curious. It was as if the entire station had silently agreed she was not worth noticing. Ethan studied her for several seconds. The more he looked, the stranger the scene became. Her clothes were clean despite their age. Her posture remained perfectly calm. There was no fear on her face. No anger. Only a quiet loneliness that seemed older than the station itself. Then, without warning, she lifted her head. Their eyes met across the crowded marketplace. For a brief moment the noise around them seemed to disappear. The alien woman's expression changed almost imperceptibly, not because she recognized him, but because someone had finally looked directly at her. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper when she spoke. "You should keep walking, human." Ethan tightened his grip on the handle of his engineering case. Instead of leaving, he took one slow step closer. The young woman's eyes remained fixed on Ethan as though she had been expecting only one of two outcomes. Either he would turn away like everyone else, or he would hesitate for a second before convincing himself that someone else would help. Instead, he quietly set his weathered engineering case beside his boots and crouched until they were nearly at eye level. The marketplace continued flowing around them without slowing. Travelers brushed past only a few feet away, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. Ethan noticed it again. Nobody looked directly at her. Even those whose path naturally pointed toward the steel pillar seemed to shift their gaze at the last possible moment. It was subtle enough to escape most people. To an engineer trained to recognize patterns, it stood out immediately. "Do you come here every day?" he asked gently. The alien woman studied him for several seconds before answering. "I have stopped counting." Her voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion wrapped inside quiet acceptance. Ethan glanced around the crowded station. "Does anyone ever talk to you?" A faint smile appeared at the corner of her lips before disappearing just as quickly. "You are talking to me now." Ethan could not argue with that. He looked toward a nearby food stand where warm bread and steaming vegetable soup filled the air with comforting aromas. "Have you eaten today?" The question seemed to surprise her more than anything else. She tilted her head slightly, silver hair slipping across one shoulder as the delicate, glowing markings beneath her eyes caught the overhead lights. "Why would that matter to you?" Ethan shrugged. "Because people usually eat every day." "Usually." She lowered her gaze again. Ethan stood without another word and walked toward the nearest vendor. The older merchant behind the counter frowned before quietly preparing a simple meal and a bottle of purified water. As Ethan reached for his wallet, the merchant leaned closer across the counter. "Human," he muttered. "You are wasting your credits." Ethan looked up. "Why?" The merchant sighed. "Everyone tries once." "Tries what?" "Being kind." Ethan frowned. "That sounds like a strange warning." The merchant glanced toward the young woman sitting alone beside the pillar. "Just take your food." Ethan returned carrying the tray and carefully placed it on the ground beside her instead of handing it directly to her. "I figured you should decide whether you want it." For several long moments, she simply stared at the warm meal. Finally, she reached forward with slow, careful hands as though she expected it to disappear before she touched it. It did not. She quietly thanked him before taking a small bite. Ethan noticed she ate slowly, almost respectfully, never wasting a single crumb. The silence between them felt surprisingly comfortable. Then something unusual happened. Every display screen within 30 feet flickered at exactly the same moment. Holographic advertisements vanished before immediately restarting. A nearby service drone stopped in the middle of the walkway, remained motionless for 3 seconds, then resumed its route as if nothing had happened. Travelers barely reacted. They simply continued walking. Ethan looked toward the malfunctioning machines, then back at the alien woman. She had not moved. She continued eating as though she had seen this happen countless times before. "That was strange," Ethan said quietly. She gave the smallest nod. "Things often become strange when someone notices me." Ethan studied her face carefully. "What does that mean?" This time she met his eyes without hesitation. Her golden pupils reflected the station lights like polished amber. "You are asking the wrong question." Ethan folded his arms thoughtfully. "Then tell me the right one." The young woman looked toward the endless crowd flowing around them before speaking so softly that only he could hear. "Ask yourself why thousands of people walk past me every day, yet somehow you were the only one who actually stopped." For several seconds, Ethan did not answer. He simply watched the endless crowd flowing around the steel pillar like water around an invisible stone. The longer he observed, the more unsettling the pattern became. Parents guided children away without realizing it. Delivery workers adjusted their routes by only a few inches. Security officers scanned every corner of the marketplace except the one where the young alien woman quietly sat. It was not fear. It was not hostility. It was as though the station itself encouraged people to forget she existed. Ethan had spent years diagnosing mechanical failures. Machines rarely malfunctioned without a reason. Human behavior usually did not either. He slowly picked up his engineering case and sat on the empty bench across from her instead of leaving. "What is your name?" he asked. The young woman remained silent for so long that he wondered whether she intended to answer at all. Finally, she lifted her eyes toward him. "Lyra." Ethan smiled naturally. "Nice to meet you, Lyra." The simple words seemed to affect her far more than he expected. She blinked once before quietly lowering her gaze again. "Most people never ask." Ethan shrugged. "Seems difficult to have a conversation without names." A faint breath that almost sounded like laughter escaped her. It disappeared as quickly as it came. "You make ordinary things sound unusual." Maybe because people have stopped doing ordinary things. Lyra looked at him carefully, as though measuring every word. "You really do not understand what is happening here." "Then explain it." She shook her head gently. "If I explain it, you will leave." Ethan leaned back against the bench and folded his arms. You seem very confident about that. Experience teaches confidence. Before Ethan could answer, his wrist communicator vibrated. A maintenance reminder appeared across the cracked display. Docking ring 8. Engine repair deadline. 3 hours remaining. He glanced at the message before dismissing it. Lyra noticed. You have somewhere else to be. Eventually. Then why are you still here? Ethan looked around the marketplace once more. Because everyone else is pretending you are invisible. Lyra's expression softened almost imperceptibly. And that bothers you. It does. Why? Ethan thought about the question longer than he expected. Because I repair broken things for a living. He smiled faintly. Today it feels like the broken thing is not a machine. Lyra remained perfectly still. The overhead lights reflected gently across the glowing markings beneath her eyes. You think people are broken? Sometimes. Ethan nodded toward the crowd. Especially when they stop seeing each other. The station speakers announced the arrival of another transport vessel. Travelers hurried toward newly opened gates while holographic maps shifted above the central plaza. At that exact moment, every display surrounding Lyra flickered again. Navigation screens briefly dissolved into static. Nearby service drones paused in perfect synchronization before restarting exactly 3 seconds later. Even the decorative fountain at the center of the marketplace stopped flowing before quietly returning to normal. Ethan watched every strange detail unfold while everyone else continued walking as though nothing unusual had happened. He looked back toward Lyra. She had not moved an inch. Tell me honestly, he said, does this happen every time someone notices you? Lyra closed her eyes for only a moment before answering. No, Ethan frowned. Then when she opened her eyes again, their golden light seemed brighter beneath the station lamps. Only when someone truly sees me. Those words settled into Ethan's thoughts with unexpected weight. He had intended to spend 20 minutes buying replacement parts before returning to work. Instead, he found himself sitting across from a lonely stranger whose very presence seemed capable of changing the behavior of people, machines, and perhaps something even larger. For reasons he could not explain, leaving no longer felt like the logical choice. The station clock rolled quietly past noon, while Ethan remained exactly where he was. His unfinished repair order continued blinking on the forgotten communicator clipped to his belt, but the reminders no longer felt urgent. Across from him, Lyra sat in the same calm posture, watching the endless current of travelers drift through the marketplace. Every face was different, every destination unique, yet none of them truly saw her. Ethan found himself testing the pattern almost without thinking. He stood, walked several yards away, then looked back. A family of tourists paused directly between them, completely blocking Lyra from view. None of them turned toward her. A maintenance robot rolled within inches of her boots before gently changing course, as though an invisible instruction had redirected its route. A security officer scanned the surrounding crowd with advanced optics, his visor passing directly across Lyra without triggering the slightest reaction. Ethan returned to the bench more unsettled than before. It is not normal, he said quietly. Lyra offered a faint nod. No, has anyone ever investigated it? Many tried. And eventually they forgot why they came. Ethan frowned. People do not simply forget something standing right in front of them. Lyra looked toward the polished station floor. They do when they have been encouraged to. Before Ethan could ask another question, a sharp electronic tone echoed throughout the marketplace. Every public display instantly replaced advertisements with a bright blue security notice. Temporary transit delay. Authorized fleet arrival in progress. Please remain calm. Travelers barely reacted. Delays happened every day. Ethan expected Lyra to ignore the announcement as well. Instead, her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. It was the first genuine emotional reaction he had seen from her. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the transparent ceiling high above the station. Ethan followed her gaze. Beyond the reinforced glass, distant lights appeared against the darkness of space. At first they resembled ordinary transport vessels approaching docking lanes. Then more lights emerged. 10, 20, 50. They moved in perfect formation, maintaining identical spacing with mathematical precision. These were not civilian ships. Ethan had spent enough years repairing freight vessels to recognize disciplined fleet movement immediately. Military, he asked. Lyra remained silent. The glow from the approaching ships reflected faintly in her golden eyes. Around them, vendors continued serving customers. Children chased one another between food stalls. Musicians never stopped playing. Somehow the arrival of an enormous fleet seemed invisible to everyone except the two people sitting beside the steel pillar. Ethan looked around in disbelief. Does nobody else think this is strange? They only see what they expect to see, Lyra answered softly. Today they expect routine inspections. Another wave of interference swept through the station. Lights dimmed for less than a second. Every holographic display dissolved into shimmering static before returning to normal. Nearby drones froze in place. Elevator doors stopped halfway open. Even Ethan's communicator restarted itself without warning. He glanced at the cracked screen. Every stored maintenance schedule had disappeared. Only one message remained. Unknown signal detected. Source unavailable. Ethan stared at the display before slowly looking back at Lyra. She had not touched the device. She had barely moved. Yet everything around her seemed to respond to her existence in ways no engineer could explain. Lyra, he asked quietly, who exactly are those ships looking for? For the first time since they had met, uncertainty crossed her face. Not fear. Not panic. Something far older. She lowered her voice until only Ethan could hear. They believe they are searching for the most dangerous being left alive. Ethan waited. She finally turned toward him with quiet sadness resting behind her luminous eyes. The problem is that they have already found her. For several long seconds, Ethan simply stared at Lyra, convinced he had misunderstood her. Around them, nothing seemed different. Vendors continued serving customers. Freight crews argued over delivery schedules. Children chased glowing toy drones between cafe tables. Life moved forward with ordinary certainty while her quiet confessions settled into the space between them. You do not look dangerous, he said at last. Lyra smiled sadly. That is because you are looking at me instead of my history. Ethan rested both hands on the handle of his engineering case. History does not scare me. It should. She looked upward once more as the distant fleet continued gliding toward the station with impossible precision. There was a time when entire civilizations believed that if I woke completely, stars themselves would answer. Ethan almost laughed before realizing she was entirely serious. The expression disappeared from his face. You believe that? No, she lowered her eyes. I remember it. A cool silence settled between them. Ethan searched for the right response and found none. Instead, he noticed another impossible detail. The station clock mounted above the central concourse had stopped moving. Every digital advertisement surrounding the plaza displayed the exact same frozen timestamp. Service drones hovered motionless in midair for nearly 5 full seconds before quietly resuming their routes. People continued walking without noticing that time itself had seemed to hesitate. Ethan checked his own communicator. Its internal clock had paused as well. Then, without warning, every device corrected itself simultaneously. He slowly lowered the screen. This happens whenever you become emotional. Lyra closed her eyes. I try very hard not to. Ethan leaned forward. You are not controlling any of this, are you? She shook her head. Not consciously. The answer somehow frightened him less than if she had admitted complete control. Before either could speak again, the older merchant from the nearby food stall quietly approached carrying 2 cups of steaming tea. He placed them on the bench without making eye contact with Lyra. For you, he told Ethan. And 1 extra. His voice trailed away as though he had forgotten who the second cup belonged to. Ethan gently slid it across the bench toward Lyra. The merchant blinked several times, looking confused. Strange, he muttered. I thought I only brought 1. Then he walked away, scratching his head as if trying to remember something that had already slipped beyond reach. Ethan watched him disappear into the crowd. He forgot you while standing right beside you. Lyra nodded. That is the gift they call protection. Protection? Long ago someone decided that if nobody could truly notice me, fewer people would try to control me. Ethan looked across the crowded station once again. That sounds more like loneliness than protection. For the first time, genuine surprise crossed Lyra's face. She searched his expression as though no one had ever described her existence that way before. Most people call it safety, she whispered. Ethan shook his head gently. Safety is choosing to be alone. He looked directly into her luminous golden eyes. This was never your choice. Lyra's calm composure wavered ever so slightly. The glowing markings beneath her eyes brightened for only an instant before fading again. Somewhere high above the transparent ceiling, one of the enormous ships separated from the approaching formation and began descending toward the station. At the same moment, every light surrounding the steel pillars softened into a warm silver glow, and for the very first time since Ethan had arrived, a little girl walking through the marketplace slowed, looked directly at Lyra, smiled, and waved before her mother gently guided her away without ever realizing what her daughter had seen. The enormous vessel descended without a sound. Unlike commercial transports that announced every movement with bright navigation lights and docking signals, this craft seemed to glide through space with quiet certainty, casting a broad silver reflection across the transparent ceiling above Carthos Central Station. Passengers paused only long enough to admire its elegant design before continuing their conversations. To everyone else, it was simply another diplomatic arrival. Ethan knew better now. He watched Lyra instead of the ship. The moment its shadow crossed the marketplace, the delicate bioluminescent markings beneath her eyes brightened with a soft blue glow. She lowered her head, not in fear, but with the weary expression of someone who recognized a chapter she had hoped would never reopen. "They are here," she whispered. Ethan glanced upward. "Can we leave?" Lyra slowly shook her head. "If I run, they will follow. If they follow, every world between here and the edge of the galaxy becomes part of the search." Ethan frowned. Then why come here in the first place? A faint breeze drifted through the station as nearby docking bays cycled open for incoming traffic. Lyra watched travelers laughing over coffee only a few yards away. "Because this was the only place where I could disappear without hiding." Ethan thought about that answer for several moments. Thousands of people surrounded them, yet she had lived in complete solitude. It was the loneliest form of invisibility he could imagine. Suddenly, every display screen throughout the marketplace changed again. This time there were no warning messages. Every advertisement faded into a blank white panel before displaying the same unfamiliar symbol, an elegant circle surrounding countless tiny stars. The image remained visible for exactly 3 seconds before disappearing. No one reacted. The crowd continued walking as though nothing had happened. Ethan looked around in disbelief. Did nobody see that? Lyra answered quietly. "They saw lights. You saw the message. What was it?" She hesitated before replying. "A greeting." Ethan turned toward her. "To you?" She nodded once. "Long ago, civilizations used that symbol whenever they welcomed the first among us." Ethan blinked. First among who? Lyra looked toward the station's ceiling where the silver vessel had finally settled into its docking cradle. The first Guardians. Before Ethan could ask another question, his engineering tablet vibrated sharply inside his case. He pulled it out expecting another maintenance reminder. Instead, every diagnostic screen had vanished. Across the display appeared a single line of text written in perfect standard galactic. "Authorized observer confirmed. Maintain visual contact." Ethan stared at the message. "This is not one of my systems." "No," Lyra said softly. "It is theirs." The message disappeared before he could touch the screen. Moments later, the tablet returned to normal as if nothing had happened. Ethan looked at Lyra with growing concern. "They know I am here." "Yes." "Should I be worried?" Lyra smiled gently. "If they intended to harm you, they would never have announced themselves." Ethan let out a slow breath, though the explanation did little to settle his thoughts. Across the station, automatic doors opened one after another in perfect sequence. Uniformed officials emerged from the main concourse, walking calmly toward the marketplace with measured steps. Their silver uniforms carried no visible insignias, yet every security officer they passed instinctively stepped aside. The officials never looked at Ethan. They never looked at the crowd. Every one of them walked directly toward the steel pillar where Lyra sat. Ethan noticed something else just before they arrived. The invisible circle surrounding Lyra had vanished. For the first time all day, people were beginning to notice the young blue-skinned woman sitting quietly in the middle of the station. Conversation slowed. Curious faces turned toward her. It was as though whatever had hidden her from the universe was quietly choosing to let the world finally see. The officials stopped exactly 10 feet from the steel pillar. None of them spoke. None of them reached for a weapon. Instead, they lowered their heads in perfect unison, an act so deliberate that the surrounding marketplace gradually fell silent. Conversations faded one by one as travelers finally noticed the blue-skinned woman they had somehow ignored for so long. Vendors stepped away from their counters. Service drones hovered motionless above the polished floor. Even the station musicians slowly lowered their instruments without understanding why. Ethan remained standing beside Lyra, unable to take his eyes off the astonishing scene unfolding around them. A few minutes earlier, she had been invisible to nearly everyone. Now hundreds of strangers stared at her with growing curiosity, as if awakening from a dream they could no longer explain. The oldest of the silver-clad officials stepped forward. His white hair shimmered beneath the station lights, and the constellation emblem Ethan had seen on every display now rested over the man's heart. He did not address the crowd. He did not address Ethan. He looked only at Lyra. "Guardian," he said softly, "we have searched for you across 37 systems." Lyra remained seated. "I know. The council requests your return." She looked at the polished floor for several quiet seconds before answering. "The council has requested many things over the centuries." The official accepted the reply with respectful silence. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody questioned her. The officials behaved as though every word she spoke carried the weight of history itself. Ethan finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind since morning. "Lyra, what is a guardian?" Before she could answer, the elderly official turned toward him for the first time. His expression held neither suspicion nor authority. It carried only quiet admiration. "You truly do not know who she is." Ethan shook his head. "I only know she has been sitting here alone." The official closed his eyes briefly before smiling. "Perhaps that is why you were able to see her." Several people standing nearby exchanged confused glances. More travelers gathered around the plaza, whispering among themselves as fragments of forgotten memory slowly returned. Some stared at Lyra with astonishment. Others looked embarrassed, suddenly realizing they had walked past her countless times without ever stopping. The official continued. "Before the first interstellar alliance existed, before our oldest worlds learned peace, there were guardians entrusted with preserving balance between civilizations. They possessed knowledge beyond empires, yet they ruled nothing. They judged no one. They simply watched over life itself." Ethan looked toward Lyra. She seemed almost uncomfortable hearing the story spoken aloud. "There was one guardian," the official said quietly, "whose presence became so overwhelming that every government feared what others might do if they discovered her. So the oldest civilizations agreed upon an impossible solution. She would be hidden not inside a fortress, but inside ordinary life. She would be remembered by history and forgotten by everyone she passed." The marketplace became impossibly still. Lyra finally looked up. Her luminous golden eyes rested on Ethan instead of the official. "It worked too well," she whispered. Ethan felt a heaviness settle in his chest unlike anything he had experienced before. "How long?" he asked. Lyra answered with a tired smile. "Long enough to forget what it felt like when someone simply stopped and said hello." The official bowed his head once more. "Guardian, the galaxy is changing. It needs your guidance again." Lyra did not respond immediately. Instead, she continued looking at Ethan with quiet gratitude that no speech could ever equal. Around them, hundreds of strangers waited for the decision of the most powerful being any of them had ever heard of. Yet the only opinion that seemed to matter to her belonged to one ordinary human engineer who had noticed the lonely woman before he ever learned the legend. No one moved after the elder finished speaking. The silence stretching across the marketplace felt deeper than any announcement or ceremony. Thousands of people stood only a few yards away, yet the entire station seemed to breathe more slowly, as though everyone feared disturbing the fragile moment unfolding before them. Ethan looked from the elderly official to Lyra, still trying to reconcile the lonely woman he had shared lunch with only hours earlier and the legendary guardian every civilization appeared to revere. Nothing about her posture had changed. She still sat on the same simple bench wearing the same weathered gray cloak. The only thing that had changed was the way everyone else looked at her. Lyra slowly rose to her feet. The movement was unhurried, graceful, and almost ordinary. Yet as she stood, every light inside the marketplace softened into a warm silver glow. Holographic advertisements quietly faded away, replaced by clear reflections of the stars drifting beyond the station ceiling. No alarms sounded. No engines roared. The station itself simply seemed to recognize her presence. She turned toward the gathered crowd instead of the officials. Many lowered their eyes in respect. Others stared with open disbelief. Several merchants who had unknowingly walked past her every morning covered their mouths in quiet embarrassment. Lyra spoke gently enough that nobody needed microphones to hear her. "Please stand." Her voice carried naturally through the enormous plaza without effort. No one should bow because they finally noticed another person. Slowly, almost awkwardly, the officials straightened. The travelers followed. Ethan watched countless strangers exchange uncertain glances as though questioning everything they believed about power. Lyra looked toward the elderly official once more. "You said the galaxy needs me." "Yes," he answered. "Old alliances are weakening. Entire worlds ask for guidance. They remember the stories. They remember you." Lyra smiled with quiet sadness. Stories remember symbols more easily than people. She turned toward Ethan. "Do you know what I missed most while I was forgotten?" Ethan shook his head. "Ordinary conversations." She looked around the station. Someone asking whether I had eaten. Someone saying good morning. Someone treating me like a traveler instead of a legend. Ethan felt unexpectedly self-conscious. "I only did what seemed normal." "Exactly." Lyra's golden eyes brightened with gentle warmth. "That is why it mattered." The elderly official stepped forward carrying a small crystal case no larger than a hardcover book. He opened it carefully. Resting inside was a luminous silver emblem shaped like the same constellation symbol that had appeared across the station displays. "Guardian," he said respectfully. "The council wishes to restore your authority." Lyra glanced at the emblem only briefly before closing the case with one fingertip. "Authority was never what I lost." The official lowered his head. "Then what was it?" Lyra looked directly at Ethan before answering. "Belonging." Another quiet silence settled across the plaza. Even the children watching from nearby cafes seemed unusually still. Ethan searched for the right words, but found none. He had repaired broken engines, rebuilt damaged reactors, and restored failing ships throughout his career. Nothing had prepared him for the realization that the most extraordinary being in the galaxy had not been waiting for power to return. She had been waiting for someone to acknowledge her existence without expecting anything in return. The evening lights streaming through the transparent ceiling slowly painted the marketplace gold, and for the first time in countless years, Lyra's smile no longer carried the weight of loneliness. The elderly official quietly closed the crystal case and stepped back without disappointment. For the first time in countless generations, someone had refused the highest honor the council could offer, and somehow the refusal felt more meaningful than acceptance ever could have. Around the marketplace, conversations slowly returned in gentle whispers. Travelers who had unknowingly passed Lyra for years looked at her with entirely different eyes now. Some offered respectful bows. Others simply smiled. The change was subtle, yet it transformed the enormous station more completely than any celebration ever could. Ethan reached for his weathered engineering case, suddenly remembering the repair assignment he had abandoned hours earlier. He laughed softly at himself. "My supervisor is going to think I disappeared." Lyra tilted her head with quiet amusement. "In a way, you did." Ethan smiled. "I suppose I did." The elderly official approached one final time. "Guardian, our ships are ready whenever you choose." Lyra looked through the transparent ceiling toward the silent fleet waiting patiently beyond the station. Their engines remained idle. Their commanders had crossed half the galaxy, yet none of them attempted to hurry her decision. She turned back toward Ethan. "Will you walk with me?" He nodded without hesitation. Together they crossed the marketplace at an ordinary pace while people respectfully stepped aside, not because they feared Lyra, but because they finally understood who she was. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Nobody avoided looking at her anymore. Children smiled openly. Merchants greeted her with quiet respect. Station workers paused long enough to wish her safe travels. The invisible wall surrounding her had vanished forever. They stopped beneath the enormous observation window overlooking the docking bays where the silver flagship waited beyond the glass. Countless stars stretched endlessly behind it. Lyra rested one hand lightly against the cool, transparent surface. "For centuries, I believed the greatest gift anyone could give me was freedom," she said softly. "Today I learned I was wrong." Ethan looked at her. "What was it?" She smiled with peaceful certainty. Recognition. Ethan remained silent, allowing the answer to settle naturally between them. After a moment, Lyra reached beneath her cloak and removed a small pendant suspended from a simple silver chain. It was not the elaborate constellation emblem the council had offered. This one was worn smooth with age, carrying only a single tiny blue crystal that glowed like a distant star. She placed it gently into Ethan's hand. "Among my people," she said, "this is exchanged only between those who truly see one another." Ethan looked down at the small pendant. "I cannot accept something so important. You already have." She carefully closed his fingers around it. "The gift was never the crystal. It was the moment you stopped walking." A boarding signal echoed softly through the docking bay. The elderly official waited quietly several yards away while Lyra took one final look across the marketplace. Then she stepped toward the waiting shuttle. Before entering, she turned back one last time. "Goodbye, Ethan Carter." He smiled. "Take care of the galaxy." A gentle laugh escaped her. "I think the galaxy will do better if it learns to take care of each other." The shuttle lifted silently into the darkness beyond the station, joining the waiting fleet until every silver vessel disappeared among the stars. Years later, visitors to Carthos Central Station often noticed a small bronze plaque attached to the same steel pillar where an unnamed traveler once sat alone. It contained only one sentence: "The universe did not change because someone discovered the most powerful being alive. It changed because one ordinary human chose to notice the person everyone else had forgotten."